Yes, we do. Okay. Thank you for counting. I'm trying to do many things in my head. So welcome to the Social Studies Department. And as I said in the previous session, we've already welcomed the attendees, so we won't do that again. Please know that we're not being rude. They've been patiently waiting for each discipline to arrive. I will hand the mic off to Amanda Williams, who is the department chair.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining the Social Studies Department. Let me just get set up for a moment. Whoops, that's not the right one. Okay. So welcome, and thank you for joining the Social Studies Department. We are all really excited to speak to you all about some things that are so passionate to all of us. And so we're going to speak about not just our philosophies of teaching, but why we teach. What is it that gets us so fired up to work so hard and engage students every day? And so the idea is that each of us will briefly speak to a couple of these points about who we are and why we teach. It's worth clarifying that all of us embrace every one of these different themes in our classrooms, but due to time constraints, we're only going to speak to a few. And then after each of us introduces ourselves and speaks to why we teach, then we'll move on to giving you some specific examples of how these philosophies get put into practice in our classes. And then after about 15 minutes, we'll eagerly take your questions. So let's go ahead and begin. Oh, that was the picture that was, well, we'll explain that picture in a moment. So as my 9th year teaching and now my 3rd year at Catlin Gable, I work pretty hard to incorporate a multidisciplinary approach. I have a background, not just in history, but in psychology and sociology, because as a younger person, I always wanted to know, well, why are things happening in the way that they are? History can be pretty ugly and brutal sometimes, and having a sense of theories that help to explain human behavior and cognition can sometimes offer additional understanding beyond just the typical political and military histories that you might see in traditional history classes. And furthermore, I really enjoy teaching students so that they have the skills to ask really challenging questions of both each other and of themselves, and also engage in difficult conversations, both in practicing listening, but being confident enough to disagree with someone else. These are things that are important, not just in the classroom, but absolutely beyond as well. So that's what energizes me to get into the classroom or into the Zoom rooms now every single day. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Patrick next.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Patrick Walsh, and I've been teaching for about 20 years, everything from college. Now I teach mostly 9th grade, and I really love working with 9th graders because they're in that great middle spot between being sort of little kids and, serious high school students, especially right now in the fall. I think one of the things I really like about teaching, I mean, I really like people and human beings, and I like the way that how unguarded teenagers are. But I really find myself drawn as a teacher to just these sort of big, daunting problems that this student's generation really has to face. My Gen Z students understand climate change. They know that they're growing up in a world that has a lot of inequality, a world where democracy isn't as certain as it used to be. And so I feel like my job as a teacher is really to focus on solutions and democratic action inside the classroom and outside of the classroom and policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The other thing I wanted to say quickly is that I really like to help demystify academic processes for my students, like the writing process, and really put them in charge. For example, very quickly this year, my students, my ninth graders, are all picking out the writing skills they feel they need the most work with. And they are focusing on those for a paper, and I give them a lot of feedback on those. Like they pick up like 3, like say introductions, topic sentences, integrating evidence, something like that. And I give them a lot of focused feedback on that, and then we can decide together if they want to move on and try and tackle something else. And so the goal really in both of those things, sort of what I teach and how I teach, is to empower the kids to have control over their own education and see themselves as really sitting in the driver's seat. Amanda?
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and invite Mickey to speak next.
Oh, hi, good evening. Mickey Del Castillo, 20th year teaching, second year at Catlin. I guess what I enjoy about teaching in the social sciences, and I think it complements some of the points that Amanda and Patrick already brought up, is that there is this continual challenge that we are facing at all times, right? I am a big proponent in embracing a climate for students where they can encounter, they can confront, they could manage the often ambiguous dynamics of history through a variety of lenses. We are actively pursuing an anti-racist curriculum. We're actively looking at historiography and modern world history. This year, I'm teaching economics and philosophy as 2 different semester courses. And what I find is the amount of interest, but also the amount of, I would say, how awake students become through I guess the life cycle of Catlin, right? Last year I was fortunate to teach with Patrick in 9th grade, and this year my honors courses tend to be predominantly seniors. And what's amazing is how much they grow and how much they benefit from those competencies of writing and thinking abstractly and then more concretely, and how confident they become in the process. So to me, that's an extremely exciting, prospect to tackle every day. It is often difficult. It is often, very complex for our students to manage. But with that being said, I'm always surprised by how well they adapt to this very unique world we're living in.
Thank you, Mickey. I'm going to pass it on to Peter next.
Hi there, I'm Peter Schulman, and I am, this is my 31st year teaching, and my 31st year teaching, 18 years ago, I got my dream job at the Catlin Gable School. And why I love being here, the reasons are manyfold, but a big one is because of the students. And one of those, I think the secret sauce of the Catlin Gable education is you get surrounded by motivated students, and it brings everybody up. And I have tremendous faith. If I give them a project and it's a reasonable one, they'll go at it and come up with some good results. A couple things that I'm doing right now, we try to be multidisciplinary. So we looked at indigenous fire practices with fire in 1630, and today among the Yurok indigenous people of California. And we did this while the smoke was keeping us inside in our houses. So it was a great time to think about that. Anti-racist and student-centered. One that we basically, open our eyes, look at voting, look what's happening right now, look at how long, who has to wait over an hour. Is it 7 times more likely if you are a person of color? And students are doing projects of their own. So there's student choice involved, but like, what is the story with voting? There's so many stories that are breaking out right now. So we're focused on that. And then finally, really try to be contemporary. Today, the last couple of days, we've been watching the hearings that are happening on the Supreme Court. And so let me I'll turn it back over to Amanda. Thank you.
All right, and then next we'll hear from Maureen.
Hi, so I teach primarily 11th and 12th graders, and you just heard from me in the English department as well. In social studies right now, I'm teaching American studies, and I've been teaching for over 20 years. This is my third year at Catlin. And I love teaching in an interdisciplinary way, and American Studies is one way that I do that. It's a way to keep learning and to keep sort of being an active interpreter of culture, thinking about the past and the present in dialogue with one another. And so I like to design courses where students can apply different skills to learning about culture. It might be historical research or sociological analysis, narrative writing, visual observation, as ways that they're learning about their own cultural stories and also engaging with the culture around them. And thinking about dialogue as a way of understanding the past and present. And sometimes they're working independently, and sometimes I create projects that involve collaboration for my students. Just to give you an example of this, the reason that we've been looking at Sacagawea is that my American Studies students recently finished a project where they picked Portland statues, such as this one from Washington Park, and researched their origins, analyzed details, and thought about arguments for and against the statues as they stand, and then made a recommendation to the city of Portland regarding these statues. And if you've been following local news, you know this is a very timely issue right now. And one of the things I appreciated about this project is many of my students said that led them to look at statues in their neighborhoods that they'd never really noticed before. So engaging with local history is a way of thinking about anti-racist thinking at a very local level.
Thank you, Maureen. So now I'm going to invite Patrick to speak again about some work that he's done with the 9th graders and the Beaverton Climate Action Plan.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an example of the kind of project-based interdisciplinary work that we do. Not always, but quite often. I mean, I think every class and every semester is punctuated by some sort of project-based learning. Last fall, I learned that the city of Beaverton was getting ready to pass or to look at its first climate action plan. And so Mickey and I had all the 9th graders look at the plan. We broke it into pieces, and groups studied a section of the plan, say transportation or equity, and they wrote responses to the plan for the city based on the research. Other students acted as editors of this long document. They created sort of a shadow document for the climate action plan, and still others used Photoshop to create images that pictured how Central Beaverton really needs to change if the city is going to hit its own goals. Amanda, could you possibly go to the next slide? If we can get to it, there it is. So this is Cedar Hills Boulevard. You probably recognize it near the New Seasons. And you can see my students made recommendations about how the space had to change to city leaders. They came up with a vision of Beaverton as a cooler, walkable place with mixed-use housing and green spaces. And these images actually were hanging outside the city council chambers when they met to consider the action plan. As a work of piece of education, I think what was great about it is that the students saw how democracy works. They felt empowered taking part in local politics, and they had a strong sense. I think they came away with like how things work in a city and how cities make decisions. And they, I think, also just felt really, really great about their ability just to immediately take part. And they wrote this long report that went through all these drafts and revisions because they knew it really counted, because it was for real. It wasn't just academic. It was something where the learning was immediately applied in the real world. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. And then I'll speak for a minute about some work that I did with my seniors in an elective for gender studies. And one unit focused on gender and leadership in particular. And so one essential question they had is, to what extent is leadership gendered? So they started the unit by going through a challenge course, and conveniently, our former head of the outdoor program had gone through designing and walking employees, both at Catlin Gable as well as corporations like Google, through these challenge courses to really achieve a number of goals, just building skills and collaboration, having more awareness, communicating more effectively, that sort of thing. But with this particular application, students were asked to work in teams, and they could win the challenge in two ways. They could either do it through a cooperative approach, where all of the teams are collectively going to try to win all of the challenges, or they could take the competitive approach where there's only one winner, and that one winner just accomplishes the most tasks. And so you can see over here, there's a couple of students going through a few of the random tasks that are put in different parts of the school campus. So it was nice because it got students out of the classroom. They were working in teams, they were talking to each other. And all the while I was taking fastidious notes that I would eventually share with students about what I observed. And they also spent some time reflecting on their own thoughts and emotions and experiences during that challenge activity. If you're curious, they went with the competitive approach. There was one team that won. They kind of scrapped the whole notion of doing the cooperative approach pretty quickly. And so when students did this, they then went back into the classroom, and we looked at a number of theories from various disciplines, this notion of emotional labor, who was trying to keep the spirits up of the group, who wasn't really interested in the results, who was maybe putting their own wants or desires aside in favor of keeping people happy. And then we took some theories from psychology. We looked at transactional leadership versus transformational leadership, this notion of leaders who are just about gains and efficiency versus transformational, which are more about inspiring the group to get the best out of themselves regardless of the result. And so both of those leadership aspects did crop up during this activity, and it was really fun for students to see, like, oh, we're actually living out these theories. This is really, really fascinating. And then we looked beyond our campus and looked at some examples of women in leadership positions and evaluated, well, how did politicians like Sarah Palin or Hillary Clinton, how were their leadership styles received by audiences, and how much of that can be chalked up to their gender? And then they closed the unit interviewing a woman in leadership, again, to match up, like, well, how much of these theories stack up to real life. So I'm going to conclude the more formal part of our presentation with that and open up the floor to questions. Oops.
No questions so far, but maybe they're coming.
I'll ask a question that I hear from prospective families, and that is, do you have conservative students and families in your classes? And regardless, sort of how are different voices heard in your classes?
I think I'll take a stab at that. Yeah, I think it's a tricky topic, and of course, I think as it's being mediated through Zoom is an interesting new experience also, because just talking to each other, that in itself is new. What I would say is, from a U.S. history perspective, that I really try to give students a firmer understanding of what I think of as sort of the bedrock principles of liberalism and conservatism, which are terms that have changed over time, and try to create some understandings of those that are abstracted and kind of put away from today's political parties. I think it's a really interesting question of whether which party embodies those because I think we're in some new territory in those regards. I think students, our students tend to be pretty nice, and I think they really try to hear others, and I think generally they want to hear more. They would like to hear more diverse opinions, because let's face it, it's a liberal city. It's a school that attracts a lot of liberal voices. So I think they are pretty open and interested in that. I'll pass the baton to anybody who would like to take it.
I am seeing a couple of questions that are coming up in the chat. So I'll go ahead and read those out loud. And if anyone would like to speak to them, just go ahead and unmute yourself, and I'll do my best to answer them if you're not, if you choose not to answer. So how do you teach students to do research, especially in this time when the internet offers both credible and questionable sources? Such a relevant question.
I'm happy to talk about that one a little bit. We're very fortunate to have an excellent librarian and assistant librarian who essentially help us to teach the skills of research when we design projects for our students. And one of the ways we grapple with that question is through teaching our students to credential their sources, meaning to consider why is this a worthy source? Who is the author of this source? Are they affiliated with the university? Are they a journalist with a longstanding publication? So we engage the students in knowing what questions to ask when they look at sources. And I would say that, there's definitely, with current topics, students are learning also how to find things that are emerging, by the moment. And one of the things we also encourage students to do when they're presenting an argument is to consider what we call an opposing point of view, which relates to the question about conservative viewpoints. So anytime our students make an argument, we're encouraging them to think about how that will be a stronger argument if they consider an opposing point of view, or as we Catlin students call it, an OPOV, as considering that as part of making their own argument. So that encourages them to look for diverse sources.
Thank you, Maureen. I'll move to the next question. How do you encourage students to get involved in civic engagement, either in Portland or in the broader statewide level? So Patrick spoke to how that took place in the 9th grade with the Beaverton Climate Action Plan. Do you want to speak to what that looks like in 9th grade this year?
Well, sure. It's a slightly smaller scale than the example I was going to give, but right now, all the 9th graders, after studying climate change policy, not just the greenhouse effect or something like that, I've encouraged them to think about how people are trying to counter climate change through policy at the local level, the state level, the federal level, and the global level. And so after looking at some of those things, like looking at the Paris Climate Accord, looking at the Green New Deal a little bit, the Biden plan a little bit, looking at things happening here in Oregon, the students are now writing letters to a policymaker at one of these levels. So they have to pick out the right level, the person they want to talk to, say, Governor Brown, and then they have to tell me, this is why I'm writing her, and this is why I'm advocating for this particular policy. And so they have to think about their audience. So now they're writing to a particular audience, and they have to be able to say, to speak to that person, right? Not to insult their intelligence and explain to the governor something she already knows, but then make a reasoned argument about how, and the students get to decide what it is that they want to argue about. Obviously, there's a limited slate of choices. So that's just a small example. We often work we work in conjunction with other departments, right, that are also doing civic engagement. But I just wanted to point out that Catlin Gables Center, that is run by George Zaninovich, who's also associated with this department, we often do large-scale projects around civic engagement. Just very quickly, a couple of years ago, all the juniors spent a few days going around Portland looking at this green loop that the city is slowly putting into effect. It's a 6-mile car-free loop around central Portland. And so the students looked at different parts of that, sort of did, some sort of design review, looked at intersections, talked to people in the city, talked to people who are architects and designers, and again, presented their response to the city's plans back to the city. So every year we try to really respond to what's happening and not just run them through some sort of canned activity, but see what's going on in the community or in the country and start from there, which is great to have the freedom to do that.
Thank you, Patrick. I'll address, there's a pretty straightforward question. Are the main topic areas government, history, geography, economics? Do students take social study classes all 4 years? So the offerings change in terms of senior electives, sometimes psychology courses, gender studies courses, there's a philosophy course this year, and teachers have the agency to choose what sort of course they're teaching. And then with all 4 years, it is not a requirement for all 4 years, but it is certainly allowed. The requirement is 3 years. So typically they'll take Human Crossroads as 9th graders, a modern world history class as 10th graders, and then they have an option, which is cool, to take either US history or they can take American studies. And then they have the option again to take electives, typically as seniors, but occasionally as juniors, that will happen as well. And then the next question, how do you teach global citizenship rather than just citizens of the United States?
Mickey, you interested in that one?
Yeah, I'll answer it. I think what's really important about how we formulate and communicate as teachers in the social studies department is almost like a continual calibration of what are we doing to inform students beyond, I guess, their immediate reality, right? So I know in Human Crossroads, we cast a very wide net in understanding the realities that people encounter in different parts of the world, whether it's in Latin America, whether it's in Africa, the Middle East, Far East Asia, Europe, United States. I also believe that the way we create global citizenship through our process is to continually exposing our students to a variety of realities that are encountered in the human narrative, right? So this year, Modern World History, right now we're discussing power and politics. Obviously it's a very important time, but we're also looking at how power and politics has shaped citizens in parts of, South Africa, looking at Shaka Zulu, or we're looking at Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Sanna Marin in Finland. And as the year progresses, we'll be looking at the UNDHR, the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And I think what we try to do to make them global citizens, and I think in the electives as we become seniors, we are able to expose them to more complex texts and more complex projects that allow them to understand that the world that they're going to now be participating in is going to be such a wider aperture that they should have a level of global citizenship, and that they shouldn't only work from a place of egocentrism or sociocentrism. And that is communicated really through process within the 4 years of the different courses they take. And though they take 3 years, a lot of the students end up, taking a lot of social studies electives, I would say.
Thank you, Mickey. I am noticing the time, and we have just a few seconds to transition between the social studies department and the arts. So our colleagues are coming in the next minute or so. I do want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and have a lovely night. Thank you for all your explanations and for answering the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye, and thank you.
Bye, Maureen. Thank you.